Domain Expansion, the pinnacle of Jujutsu sorcery, and today we're going to talk about every one that has appeared in Jujutsu Kaisen so far so that you can get a better understanding of how they work. But first, I want to do a brief overview of what a domain expansion is, because it's probably not as straightforward as you think. A domain is essentially a sorcerer's mental landscape that they are born with, and it serves as their base for their cursed technique. When a domain is expanded, the sorcerer is essentially using cursed energy to expand that landscape past their brain. They then use a barrier to create a closed environment that is entirely their curse technique. Each domain requires a hand signal to activate, and this varies user to user. These domains also differ person to person as they are dependent on the user's mentality and personality. So even if two people have the same technique, they might not have the same domain. If two sorcerers create domains at the same time, it starts a clash of domains. And in this case, the most refined domain will win out. After a sorcerer uses their domain, they are unable to use their curse technique for a short period of time. However, in this time period, they can still use cursed energy in general, including reverse curse technique and anti-domain techniques such as simple domain or falling blossom of emotion. In general, there are two types of domains, lethal and non-lethal. Lethal are probably what you think of when you think of a domain expansion. They give the user enhanced combat abilities by amplifying their curse technique and guaranteeing that any curse techniques used in the domain will hit. This is often considered the sure hit effect or can't miss effect. Non-lethal domains are generally more unique. By making a domain non-lethal, it becomes easier to construct, trading power for utility, as everyone within the domain must follow a set of rules that is embedded in the curse technique. There is a third, less prevalent version of domains, and that is barrierless domains. Only a couple of characters in the show are capable of summoning barrierless domains. In both cases, they are lethal domains that retain the sure hit effect despite not having an outer wall. At this point in time, we don't know a lot about these domains, but they are generally considered even more powerful than domains with a barrier. It's worth noting that if a barrierless technique and a barrier technique are created at the same time, they can coexist, but only if the domains are equally refined. With all that out of the way, we can finally get into the actual domains. We will be going in the order that domains are introduced, with the exception of Sukuna, as his domain is introduced in the very first episode, but it's not explained until much later on. So let's get started with Jogo's domain, Coffin of the Iron Mountain. Coffin of the Iron Mountain is a lethal domain. It encloses the user and the target in the interior of a volcano, with magma spouting out of the floor. The heat in this domain on its own is enough to kill the average Jujutsu sorcerer. In this domain, Jogo has the ability to control all the rocks and magma as well, which allows him to create his sure hit effect. The name comes from the legend of the 9 mountains and 8 seas from ancient Indian cosmology. The legend speaks of Mount Sumeru, which is surrounded by 8 rings of golden mountains. The 9th mountain is made out of iron, and it sits at the edge of the world. Our next domain is Infinite Void, and it is the domain belonging to Gojo. Infinite Void has an environmental effect much like Coffin of the Iron Mountain. Victims of this domain are forced to absorb infinite information. This overwhelms the victim, completely immobilizing them. While this effect does no physical damage to the target, it does do damage to the brain if the victim is subjected to it without anti-domain measures. The only way to negate this effect without an anti-domain measure is to touch Gojo himself, as anyone he makes contact with is not affected. In the manga, we see Gojo draw a domain for just 0.2 seconds. This basically applies the effects of the domain to all within the radius without fully forming a barrier. During his fight with Sukuna, we learn that Gojo also has the ability to change the conditions of his domain at will. We see him change the hardness of his barrier and the size of it, making it extremely small and extremely large. During this fight, we also learned that it is possible to use reverse curse technique to restore a curse technique during domain burnout, but doing so damages the part of the brain responsible for curse techniques. This prevents the sorcerer from casting a new domain, and it is unclear if this effect is permanent. Next is Self-Embodiment of Perfection, the domain belonging to Mahito. Unlike the first two, which have environmental effects, Self-Embodiment of Perfection just increases the effectiveness of Mahito's technique. However, due to the nature of his technique, this makes it one of the most deadly domains against humans. This domain does force Mahito to touch the soul of anyone inside, but that's really only a negative when he's facing Yuji. Interestingly, this is the only domain that requires 2 pairs of hands to activate. This could be part of the reason that Mahito was able to summon his domain with such little experience, as Jujutsu is an art of subtraction, so by adding an additional hand sign, the ability got easier to create. Next, we have Megumi's domain expansion, Chimera Shadow Garden. This domain is a pseudo-barrierless domain, as Megumi has to use environmental walls in the place of a barrier in order to cast it, so technically it is an incomplete domain, but we're still going to talk about it. Chimera Shadow Garden floods an area with the shadows from the 10 shadow techniques. This shadow can be used for a multitude of purposes, but the main one is summoning Shikigami. The user can also create shadow versions of themselves with the fluid and amplify their cursed energy to deceive opponents. But where this ability gets really wild is the manga. During the Shibuya incident, it is shown that the shadows from this domain can be used to poke holes in the barriers of other domains. This requires a huge amount of of concentration and cursed energy, but it creates an escape route and prevents the activation of the sure hit effect from the other domain. Later in the manga, during Megumi's fight with Reggie-Star, we see yet another aspect of this domain. The weight of any items Megumi has in the shadows must be bared by him while the domain is open. It is also during this fight that we learn that the shadows themselves are basically an endless abyss in which non-users of the technique can drown. To be honest, it's kind of hard to tell how much of this is just 10 shadows and how much is restricted to just the domain. Kinda shows just how flexible this technique is. Next we have the small Pox Deity. Listen, I know no one cares about this one, but the title says every domain, so we gotta cover every domain. Luckily this one's pretty simple. The domain expansion of the small Pox Deity traps the victim in a coffin and buries them underground. It then drops its innate technique on top of the coffin. If the victim cannot escape by the count of 3, they will get smallpox and die. Now let's move on to a more interesting one, Horizon of the Captivating Skandha. This is the domain for the disaster spirit Dagon. Despite being a generally calm domain, this domain is still considered lethal, especially with its sure hit Death Swarm, which launches a swarm of Shikigami to its targets. These Shikigami are not visible to the victims, and as such they only appear when they start to devour their flesh. This ability is very effective even against strong sorcerers, as we saw it single-handedly hold back Nobito, Nanami, and Maki. However, for this sure hit effect to be sustained, the barrier of the domain must also be sustained. This domain also serves as the meeting place for the disaster curses and Kenjaku pre-Shibuya. It is unclear if this domain was constantly being sustained by Dagon, or if he only cast it when the domain was necessary. If it is the former, it is also unclear why he was able to sustain it for such a long time. Next we have the first barrierless technique, Malevolent Shrine, which of course belongs to Sukuna. Malevolent Shrine can cover a radius of up to 200 meters, but Sukuna can make it smaller if he wants to. This is usually done to concentrate the power of the domain or to just avoid slashing something. When the sure hit is activated, everything within the range of the domain is hit by Sukuna's 2 slashing techniques, Cleave and Dismantle. Sukuna can even target which techniques he wants to use on what, so things with cursed energy will get hit by cleaves and things with no cursed energy will get hit with Dismantle. This will continue indefinitely until Sukuna makes the domain disappear or until Sukuna is too damaged to sustain the domain. It is worth noting that the barrierless quality of the domain can be mitigated if an opponent with a barrier domain expands their domain larger than Sukuna's radius and then shrinks their domain. This is likely because the barrier of a barrier domain does not identify whose domain it is containing, but that's just speculation. Much like Gojo, Sukuna can also change the conditions of his domain as well via a binding vow. And also just like Gojo, he is unable to currently use his domain due to brain damage, but it is unclear if this is a permanent effect. Next we have the first kind of complicated domain. It's Deadly Sentencing, the domain of Higuruma. Deadly Sentencing is a non-lethal domain that puts its users in a courtroom with Higuruma in the role of prosecutor and the opponent in the role of the defendant. The domain is imbued with a legal-based technique and it centers around the Shikigami Judgeman. In this domain, Judgeman knows all information about the prosecutor and defendant, but that information is not shared with either sorcerer. This is the general sequence of events that happens within the domain once it is cast. First, Judgeman will announce the charges against the defendant, which are actual crimes possibly committed by the defendant. Then the accusation will be reviewed, and the defendant is given one chance to defend their case. They have 3 options: stay silent, confess to the crime, or deny the crime. The defendant's goal is to prove their innocence by dispelling all doubt of their innocence, and this can be done by any means necessary. Then, Higuruma will attempt to rebuttal the defendant's statement. This is done with evidence delivered to the prosecutor by Judgeman. This evidence is not necessarily conclusive and it will not be shared with the defendant. Once both parties have made their statements, Judgeman will deliver a verdict. If the defendant is found guilty, they will be punished in accordance to the harshness of the crime. So far, we have seen 2 possible punishments. The first is confiscation, which prevents the defendant from using their curse technique. If the defendant has no curse technique, they will instead be prevented from using cursed energy in general. The other possibility is confiscation plus death penalty. This enacts the effects of confiscation and gives the prosecutor the executioner's sword, which kills anyone that is cut by it without exception. This is the general flow of the domain, but there is also a potential 5th action, which is the defendant requesting a retrial. This can only be done if the defendant is found guilty without an open confession and can reverse any effects enacted on them. It's time for the one you've all been waiting for, Idle Death Gambit from Hakari. This is a non-lethal domain based on a real pachinko machine and its theme song, Private Pure Love Train. In this domain, Hakari aims to get a jackpot by lining up 3 of the same symbols, which are different characters from Private Pure Love Train. There's Aya Sato, Sayuri Amangawa, Yumi Asagiri, Hiro Kato, Suzuka Shizumu, Sayaka Yamaguchi, and Yuki Yamaguchi. These are honestly not that important to the domain. Upon casting the domain, all the rules of the game are transferred into the opponent's brain using the domain's sure hit effect. Because the domain is non-lethal, it is able to be constructed without much effort, and it can also be activated in under 0.2 seconds. When the domain starts, the game is in normal mode, which has a neutral stage. Once combat begins, Hakari can summon 3 different visual effects: Shutter Doors, Reserve Balls, and Consecutive Events. Both Shutter Doors and Reserve Balls are offensive attacks, with Shutter Doors being summonable to crush opponents, and Reserve Balls acting as a ranged attack. Consecutive Effects basically reflects damage on Hakari back to the opponent, but none of these are the actual main uses of the visual effects. Hakari must summon one of these 3 visual effects to advance to a Riichi scenario, which is where the roll for jackpot happens. Each of these 3 visual effects has 3 different colors indicating the likeliness of a jackpot. Green has the lowest likeliness, red has the middle, and gold has the highest. For consecutive effects, this is indicated by the multiplier. There is also a rainbow colored indicator that guarantees a jackpot. For consecutive events, this is a ×4 multiplier. While Hakari can choose which of these 3 effects he wants to summon, he cannot control which color they are, making it entirely luck dependent. Once a visual effect is summoned, there are 4 different Riichi scenarios the game can advance to. Each one has a different chance of hitting a jackpot. The first is Transit Card Riichi, where if Yuki passes through the station gate and gets to work on time, Hakari hits a jackpot. This one has a very low chance of succeeding. The second is Seat Struggle Riichi. This one has a moderate chance of success, but we have no other information on it yet as we have not seen it. The third is Potty Emergency Riichi. In this one, hero must reach the Shin Yurigaoka station without pissing themselves, and if they do, Hakari gets a jackpot. And the final Riichi is Friday Night Final Train, where if Yumi doesn't board her train, Hakari hits the jackpot. This Riichi has the highest chance of success of the 4. If Hakari does not hit a jackpot, the stage reverts back to the start, and the cycle will restart until Hakari hits a jackpot or runs out of chances to win. Each spin that a jackpot is not won, the number of possible spins decreases. If a jackpot is hit, Hakari gains unlimited cursed energy and automatic reverse cursed energy, which can process any and all injuries, making him basically unkillable for 4 minutes and 11 seconds. This time is specifically to match up with the song Admiring You, and when a jackpot is hit, this song will play out loud around Hakari. After the song ends, his cursed energy returns to normal levels, but at this point his curse technique will already have been replenished, so he will be able to cast his domain again and restart the cycle again. The conditions from the previous game do carry over to the next, and the roll from the previous round also infects the environment for the next round. If Hakari hits jackpot on odd numbers, the domain will have better odds in a neutral state. If he hits the jackpot on even numbers, the domain will start with faster spins, which I believe decreases the probability. On top of that, there is also the chance the domain will start in a hidden probability, which has a better chance of hitting jackpot. That was a lot, but now that I've said it, it doesn't actually seem that complicated. Anyway, we still have 3 domains to cover, so let's move to Cursed Naoya's domain, Time Cell Moon Palace. Time Cell Moon Palace is a lethal domain that takes the projection sorcery technique to the next level. Its sure hit effect launches animation frames into the neck of the victim, forcing them to move in the 24 frame per second rule present in the technique. This domain heightens the precision of the 24 frame per second rule, to the point that it can even target individual cells, forcing some to stop and others to not. This causes tons of small cuts to appear all over the victim's body and also causes them to suffer internal injuries as well. This immobilizes the victim in the process, as moving without abiding by the rule can cause limbs to be severed completely. Next we have Kenjaku's domain expansion, Womb Profusion. This is the other barrierless domain, but we don't know as much about it. We know it was able to create a strong force enough to gravely injure Yuki, but we don't know exactly what that was. It seems like it was related to anti-gravity system, but I'm not 100% sure, because it wouldn't make sense for Kenjaku's domain to be tied to someone else's technique. Regardless, this domain is extremely refined, as it was able to quickly dismantle Simple Domain, which was invented with the express purpose of countering domains. Between this and Tengen's struggle to dismantle the domain, it is implied that barrierless domains are more effective against anti-domain techniques. But this is kind of contradicted by the Gojo and Sukuna fight, as we see Gojo use a ton of anti-domain techniques that seem pretty effective against Sukuna's barrierless domain, but also that's Gojo, so he's probably the exception, not the rule. Our last domain expansion is unfortunately another one we don't know a ton about. It's Yozuru's domain, Threefold Affliction. As far as we know, this is a simple lethal domain that guarantees Yozuru's constructs will hit their target. This could be super powerful, especially when combined with Perfect Spear, but we never get to see this potential realized because, well, she dies. Also, what's with Gege making a bunch of domains based around female genitalia? First there's Time Cell Moon Palace, which is pretty suspicious. Then there's Womb Profusion, and also this one, which has a bunch of unique hanging things. Anyway, that's all the domain expansions in Jujutsu Kaisen. If you're curious why I didn't talk about Yuta, Uro, or Ryu, it's because we never got to see what their domains actually did. We just know they have access to use them. If you have any questions, be sure to let me know in the comments down below and I will answer them to the best of my ability. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to subscribe as it is the best way to support this channel, aside from watching another video or using a membership for direct support. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you next time for another video.